Hi, everybody. My name is John Tong. Mrs. Sherman has asked me to tell you guys a story about how my father came to be in the United States. I'm a storyteller, so I write stories about things that happen to me in my life, and I tell them to perfect strangers. But obviously, the story I'll be sharing with you guys is very personal. Um, I just want to say to begin, like I used to be a really good history student, and I knew that a lot of people didn't like history, social studies, because they're always like, oh, you had to memorize all these boring facts. And for me, I always just tried to figure out the story that was going on in whatever we were studying history. Sort of like if you knew the characters and all the people, what their motivations were, why they were doing what they were doing. So it was a lot easier to kind of pluck the facts into that story, which made it easier to tell to other people. Kind of like if you were telling people what happened in your favorite TV show or movie. But my father came over from China in 1949, which I know sounds like a really long time ago. But my father had me when he was older, so I don't want you to think I'm that old. But what was going on in China in 1949 was very, very important in Chinese history, and has had huge effects also in American history as well. So I feel like I can't really launch into telling you the story about my dad without giving you guys at least a little bit of background about what was going on before then and what happened afterwards. I'm just going to take you guys back, and we're going to talk a little bit about Chinese history, starting from probably about the mid late 1800s, and we're going to go all the way through the 21st century. And a lot of this really matters to you guys because Chinese history and American history is becoming more and more intertwined. By the time you guys graduate high school, economists estimate that China's GDP will be larger than the United States, and that will be the first time ever, really in modern history, that another country has had a larger economy than the United States. And so, what happens in China is going to have a much larger impact on your generation of Americans than any previous generation before. So I got to give you guys a little bit of idea of how modern China came to be, and I think my father's story of how he came to be in the United States gets at that pretty well. This is a photograph of my dad and my grandfather from 1948. My grandfather's the guy seated there. And he looks pretty tough, doesn't he? It looks like some kind of like kung fu tough guy. I mean, somebody you don't want to mess with. And that's my dad standing next to him. My dad's about 20 in this photograph and was taken a year before he left China. And this is the last photograph that they ever took together. My grandfather was a landlord, which meant that he owned thousands and thousands of acres of land in China, and he had all of these tenant farmers who worked the land. And they were like in Russia they were called like serfs, and sometimes you might hear the term sharecropper. But basically, the idea is that these farmers had to pay rent to my grandfather in order to stay on the land and continue to farm. And if they had a bad harvest, if there was a drought or if there was something wrong with their crops, they had to pay rent to my grandfather or they got kicked out. And if they got kicked out, that meant that they might starve to death. So basically, my grandfather had a lot of power over these people's lives, and he was very rich and they were very poor. And this is a map of modern China, and as we know it today, and you can see in the upper northeast of the map, you see Beijing, that's the capital of China. And my family was from a town that was a little northwest of Beijing, kind of a suburb called Hopei. But China didn't always look like this. I want to take you back in time to 1911 just to show you what China looked like, about 100 years ago. You can see that yellow area was what was actually kind of China. And those other, that red and green and blue and orange area were parts of the region that sometimes China would invade, and sometimes those parts of the region would invade China. But that yellow area was controlled by Chinese emperors for thousands of years. And I mean thousands of years. Chinese civilization goes back 4,000 years. So it's as old as the Egyptian civilization or Indian or Babylonian. If you think about it, it's the recorded history in England goes back like 2,600 years. So about 1,500 years older than England. And during that period of time, for 4,000 uninterrupted years, emperors have been ruling China. But starting around the 1800s, a bunch of other countries start coming into China and beginning to come colonize from Europe, like France and Britain, and they are kicking China's butt. In fact, a whole bunch of European countries start coming into China and putting in their own colonies and laying their own claim to the country. And a lot of people in China start getting very angry about that. They want to push out all these Western countries, and that starts something called the Boxer Rebellion. And it was called the Boxer Rebellion because people in Britain had never seen martial arts or kung fu before, so they just called it boxing. And apparently, if history teaches us anything, kung fu not very effective against guys with rifles, and so China is constantly losing these wars to outside powers, and then Japan is beginning to organize itself, and they say they want to get in on the action, and they start invading China as well. And there's a series of wars between China and Japan. The first one is actually over Korea, which today you know as North and South Korea, but at the time was unified in one country. Of course, South Korea gave us this guy, and North Korea is ruled by this guy, who kind of looks like the kid from Up, but actually is the only world leader sporting a butt cut. Where were we? This is Empress Qi, and she was ruling China in 1911 during all of this period of time where China was basically getting its butt kicked. And in 1911, most people in China had had enough. And in 1911, a guy named Dr. Sun Yat-sen, along with a lot of other unhappy people in the country, lead a revolution called the Chinese Revolution of 1911. And they overthrow the empress, and they try to install a democracy in China, kind of modeled after the United States, you know, with free vote and freedom of expression, kind of like how we live today. But what the one thing that the Empress was really good at was holding the country together and cracking down on people that had that descended against her. And so what quickly happens after the Chinese Revolution of 1911 is all these warlords start popping up throughout China and declaring that they're the people in charge of their region. And this map shows you, you know, these different regions that these warlords claimed. And one thing to note is kind of in the northeast part of China, you know, that was kind of like the old west of China. It was, you know, not poorly, it was very poorly policed, and there was all these bandits that lived up there, and some of them were just criminals, but some of them were like these farmers, like these tenant farmers that got kicked out, and there wasn't a unified national, you know, military or anything like that to go and deal with them. And so this, before my father was even born, my grandfather, who's this wealthy landlord, would occasionally get kidnapped by these bandits, and they would demand all of this money, you know, thousands of silver pieces and that sort of thing. But because they were farmers, they had to wait until the harvest, and these bandits would hold on to my grandfather for months while they waited for their money to come after the farmers had taken the crops to market and made money and given it to my grandfather's family. But every time he was released unharmed. And that brings us to this guy, General Chiang Kai-shek. In 1928, two important things happened. First, Chiang Kai-shek, who was friends with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, led a military coalition to defeat all of the warlords, and over a period of years, he was able to defeat them all and to unify China into one country, basically the China that we know today. And that started this kind of nationalistic period. But the other thing that happened in 1928 was my father was born. And my dad was born into a traditional Chinese family, but he was the second son. That means he had an older brother. And in traditional Chinese society, the all the wealth of a family would go from the father to their firstborn son. And anyone else, the other sons, the sisters, would get very small inheritances, and it would be completely dependent on the firstborn son. Not only that, if you were the secondborn son like my dad, or the sisters, or any other sons that came along, you basically venerated, you honored your older brother. He was like an adult. He was like a parent. He was somebody that was in charge. And for any of you younger brothers and sisters like I am out there, that could probably be a pretty hard pill to swallow. But my dad loved his brother very, very, very much. So even though Chiang Kai-shek had defeated the warlords and unified China into one country, he had another problem on his hands, and that was the rise of the popularity of communism in China and a formation of a communist party led by Mao Zedong, who was a Marxist thinker who was heavily influenced by the revolution that it occurred in Russia and the Soviet Union a few years before. And Mao Zedong wanted to bring communism to China, and he was calling for a revolution that would overthrow Chiang Kai-shek and the existing nationalist government and all of the rich people he thought they served, and would instead focus on helping the poorest people in China, like the farmers that were working on my grandfather's land. And what he was saying to them was, look, we're going to take away private property rights from everybody, so that people like my grandfather wouldn't own this farmland anymore, that everybody would have to share, that they would have to work together, and that everybody would be taken care of because the state would come in and make sure that everybody had exactly what they needed. And he was promising people that their lives, on the poorest spectrum of things, that their lives would get much, much better, and that their only real enemy was the very wealthy. Chiang Kai-shek hated the communists, and with help from a lot of countries, including the United States, he began to fight a war against them. And he was doing great. He had the communists up against the ropes, and things looked really, really bad for them until 1937, when Japan invaded China. And this is all right before World War II. Japan is very expansionistic and taking over countries left and right, and they begin to invade China. And so Chiang Kai-shek realizes he can't fight both the communists and the Japanese, and so he calls for a truce. And the nationalists and the communists, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, begin working together to fight against the Japanese. And this uneasy truce lasts until the end of World War II. So around this time in 1937, when the Japanese are invading, tragedy strikes my family, and my uncle, my father's older brother, dies of an appendicitis at 21. My uncle was actually an opera singer in the Beijing Opera, but when he dies, my father is devastated. It's his older brother. My uncle is the firstborn son, so obviously there had been a lot of attention on him, and my grandparents are very devastated at the loss, but they immediately start treating my father, who now is the oldest son, like he's the firstborn son. And they want to remove all of the pictures. They won't talk about my uncle anymore. And my father, who's been raised to just sort of, kind of worship his brother, really resents this. And he doesn't like the way that he kind of uses them kind of dishonoring his brother when it's just kind of how they're dealing with their loss. But my father really, at his age of his teenage years, really comes to resent his parents. During the Japanese occupation of China in the late 30s and early 1940s, things remained more or less the same for my father's family. They still own all of their land, and they're still making a lot of money from their farming. But another thing remains the same, which is that they're still bandits. And but they are a little bit different now. Some of them have become a little bit more politically oriented, and they have learned a little bit about communism, and They've become influenced by it. And the third and final time that my grandfather is ever kidnapped is by these bandits. They're kind of like early communists. They really just don't like rich people. And they've heard a rumor that my grandfather had abused a beggar, which wasn't actually true. It was actually his cousin, but they kidnap him and realize my grandfather is much wealthier, so they hold on to him. And during this time, they torture my grandfather and they beat him up a bunch. And it's because, they resent, the kind of class of people my grandfather's from. And my grandfather would have died from his treatment during this time, except he makes friends with this guard who had gone to Beijing University and had gotten addicted to drugs. And my grandfather helped him overcome his drug addiction, and this younger guy helped my grandfather survive by giving him food and medicine, and and keeps him alive long enough for my family to raise enough money to get my grandfather released. And so when my grandfather goes back to his home, he takes this young man with him, and he lives with my grandfather and helps my grandfather out for the rest of his life. My grandfather is very changed by this experience, and he decides that he has had a religious experience, and he converts his family to Catholicism. Catholicism wasn't very popular at the time in China, but my grandfather, when he converted to Catholicism, kind of so did all of those tenant farmers that lived on his land. Some of them, most of them probably didn't even know it, but when he became Catholic, kind of everybody became Catholic that lived on his land. But even though my grandfather got very active in the church, he got very, very involved in philanthropy and donating his time and resources and energy and money to opening these schools for very poor kids and giving them an education and clothing them and so on. And that becomes really important later on in his life because a lot of those kids end up becoming Communist Party leaders. As you probably know, in 1945, the United States dropped two atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, and that ended World War II, as the war in Europe was already over, and Japan unconditionally surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped. And in China, things were very bad after basically centuries of war, and now the worst war they'd ever seen. So many people in China were completely impoverished and starving. Famine was widespread, and it was also during this time that the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, resumed their war against one another. Now that the Japanese were gone, they could go back to settling who was in charge of China. And eventually, over the course of the next 4 years, Mao Zedong and the communists, with the support of people, common people from all around the country, eventually defeat Chiang Kai-shek. And in 1949, they're about to invade Beijing and declare victory. As the war between the nationalists and the communists was kind of beginning to come to an end, my father was still very angry at his parents because because of the way he felt that they kind of dishonored his older brother. And to get back at them, he decided that he would become a Catholic priest. And that's a really big deal in Chinese culture, not because he was a priest, but because priests can't marry and they can't have any children. And that's a huge issue in China because ancestry and being able to trace your roots back is very, very important in Chinese culture. And if my father didn't have any children, there were no other sons in the family, and then that would mean that the family name, the Tong family name, uh, you know, as it had been going on in our family, would end with my dad after he died. And my grandfather was very, very upset about this and didn't want him to do it. But because the communists were about to invade Beijing, he decided that they had to get my dad out of the country. People had heard horrible things that the communists had done, and that it was very likely that that the family would get killed because the communists had been killing rich people. And so he got my father out of China on the last plane that flew out of Beijing to the United States before the communists invaded the airport in Beijing. So my father made it on the very last plane to leave for the United States out of China. When my father arrived in America, he figured that, like many people, that the communists couldn't stay in power, that they were a bunch of bandits, and they were uneducated and poor, and they couldn't create a country that would last. But of course, we know that they did stay in power, and my father was a priest in the United States for a few years, but he eventually began teaching Chinese philosophy at Catholic University of America, where he met my mother, and he decided to renounce his vow as being a priest, and he fell in love with my mom, and they got married, and then they had two kids, my brother and myself. So when he never heard back from his family in China again until 1976, when he got a letter that said that his father had died. 1976, the Communist Chinese government lets my father come back to the country to go to his father's funeral, and my dad learns what happens to my grandfather and the rest of his family. When he left, the communists took over, and a lot of people, like my grandfather, were executed because they were considered to be corrupt landlords that had oppressed the poor people. But because my grandfather had been a philanthropist and opened up those schools that those Communist Party leaders went to when they were kids, they decided that my grandfather was a good guy, but he needed to be re-educated. And so they sent him and his family out to these farming communes out in the western part of China, and life was very hard, and it was very, very tough. They endured famines and illnesses, and they spent the rest of their lives struggling to get back to their homeland and their hometown. And when they got back there, they discovered that the home that their family had lived in for hundreds of years was now occupied by a communist Chinese leader. And my father was very sad to learn everything that his family had endured, and he was really sad to know that his father didn't know that he didn't end up staying a priest, and that he'd had two sons, so the Tong family name would continue. And that was very hard for my dad, and I guess he kind of regretted that, when he was a teenager and he was trying to rebel against his parents because he was so angry at them, that he ended up making a decision that he couldn't take back. But ultimately, he was just very happy he had two sons, and I like to think that's sort of a happy ending. But just wanted to thank all of you for taking a minute to listen to a little bit about my family history. I think it happened during a really interesting period of time in Chinese history, and I think that it shows you guys a little bit about how China became the country that it is today, which isn't a purely communist country, but certainly one that is very dominated by their central government in sometimes very oppressive ways against the human rights of the Chinese people. But I will say that China and the United States are working together more and more, as well as China and other countries around the world. And certainly for your lives, the rest of your lives, there will be lots of opportunities that will come about for your generation because of China, and there'll be lots of conflicts as well. And I hope that you'll find this more interesting and you'll learn more about it on your own. Thanks.